Jade is one of those frames that you either love her or she's not for you, but I found myself really enjoying her much more since my community got me to retake a look at her, and with the trailer for our next big patch, the sequel to Jade Shadows Constellations, I've been finding myself really enjoying her gameplay. She can do it all: fantastic squad supporting, incredible survivability, great damage output, a variety of buffs, not to mention that she can take to the skies with some impressive nuking capabilities, and with the lead up to the launch of our newest patch, Digital Extremes has brought back her special operation Belly of the Beast to give you all another chance to farm this spectacular frame and get a bunch of great cosmetics and rewards at the same time. But don't worry, if you're watching this after the operation ends, you'll still be able to of course farm her by doing the normal version of the Ascension mission on Brutus Uranus. So let's go over her kit for those of you who don't know how she functions, and then let's get into some endgame builds for you all to try out yourself and get some inspiration for your own cool builds. First up is her passive, which has two parts. The first being is that she has 2 aura slots rather than the usual 1, giving her not only some pretty versatile build crafting options, but also significantly greater amount of mod capacity, as auras will give rather than cost capacity, and if you're properly matching your aura polarities to the mod polarity, you can potentially get 36 more mod capacity, bringing her up to an insane 96 capacity, making building her a breeze, and you'll need significantly less form on her than usual. The other aspect of her passive is Judgement, which is a debuff that enemies can get from Jade that will give them a 50% damage vulnerability debuff for 10 seconds, significantly increasing your damage output. Her first ability, Light's Judgment, will have a 100% chance to apply Judgment to enemies when they walk into its AoE, and her fourth ability, Glory on High's primary firing mode, will have a 10% chance per hit to apply Judgment. Also, when an enemy affected by Judgment gets finished off, her second ability, Symphony of Mercy, will get its duration increased by 2 seconds no matter who gets the final blow. It also has a synergy with Glory on High's alternate fire mode, which we'll cover when we get to that ability. Her first ability, Light's Judgment, will throw down a light well on the ground when cast, of which you can have up to 5 active at once, and any ally including defense targets, specters, players, and whatnot will receive healing while within its radius, and when you or your ally leaves its area or it expires, they'll receive a healing over time buff that lasts for the duration of the ability. For most things in the game, it'll replenish a percentage of their health per second, and for defense targets, it'll heal them for 75 health a second. Enemies who are within the area or walk into it will have her passive Judgment applied to them, making them 50% more vulnerable to damage, and the ability will deal a small amount of heat damage but doesn't apply heat status effects. Both enemies and allies can only be affected by 1 Light's Judgment at a time, so it's best to spread them around for maximum coverage. Jade will also be affected by the healing over time buff of the ability on cast even if she's not within the radius when it lands on the ground. This ability has an augment, Jade's Judgment, which will give all enemies who are within Light's Judgment AoE a chance to spawn a Jade Light Beam over their head, basically like how the Jade Xmas units work, following the enemy around and dealing heat damage and status effects that ramps up over time the longer it's affecting them. And duration will increase the duration of the beam, thus increasing its potential maximum damage with that ramp up function, and strength will increase the chance of the beam spawning. When the target of the beam is finished off, it'll despawn even if it has more duration available to it, and a maximum of 8 beams can be active at once. Her second ability, Symphony of Mercy, has 3 separate functions to it. If you tap cast, you'll rotate between the 3 different buffs even while it's active, and hold casting it will turn on the ability, and all 3 will affect you and all allies within affinity range. The first and default buff is Power of the 7, giving ability strength. The second option is Deathbringer, which increases weapon damage with additive damage. Finally, the third option, Spirit of Resilience, which will increase your shield regeneration rate and reduce the time in which your shields will begin recharging, and that regeneration will even give you overshields. One interesting thing about this is that you'll be able to swap around the buffs on the fly. So if you're wanting to maximize her capabilities, you can activate the ability strength buff before you cast her other abilities to get them some more strength, which will snapshot that strength into those abilities, then swap to Deathbringer or Spirit of Resilience, giving you potentially significantly more damage or increasing buffs from helmet abilities if you're using those. Like mentioned in the passive section, finishing off enemies affected by Judgment's debuff will increase the duration of Symphony of Mercy by 2 seconds for each slain foe. Also, for those interested, Symphony of Mercy's Deathbringer is able to be used with helmet buffs like Roar, Eclipse, and Zada's Whisper. Jade's third ability, Ophanim Eyes, will slow down all enemies up to a maximum of 90% within its frontal cone, dealing heat damage to all enemies within sight, and will permanently remove their armor and shield slowly over time. Ability strength will increase the rate of armor and shield reduction, so I'd highly recommend using a good bit of strength to make this ability more effective. Once their defenses are completely removed, its heat damage will apply a single heat status effect to them. The slowing function won't affect any enemy with overguard, but they'll still have their armor and shields removed and still take heat damage, and take a heat status effect once those defenses are removed. Additionally, if an ally falls while it's active, looking at them with your Ophanim Eyes will pause their bleed out timer and allow you to revive them from range over a short period of time, and if things have gotten really rough, this will actually revive multiple allies at once. Tap casting the ability while it's active will refresh its duration, and hold casting it will cancel the ability if you feel like you need to. When enemies leave the cone by either walking away or by you looking away, they'll slowly recover their movement speed, but their armor and shields won't recover even if you didn't remove them fully. And lastly, we have our fourth ability, Glory on High, and its exalted weapon, Glory. When cast, Jade will take to the skies, becoming history's strongest helicopter mom, and activate her exalted weapon. This is a channeled ability, so it will slowly reduce your energy while it's active, and makes it so that you can't regain energy from energy per second sources such as Zeneric's passives or Archon stretch. And the normal firing mode of Glory won't cost any energy per shot, but the alt fire mode will cost energy with each activation. Like all channeled abilities, ability duration and efficiency will both affect that energy drain per second, decreasing or increasing its energy drain depending on the values of those stats, and efficiency will affect the energy cost of the alt fire activation. When in the air, she'll receive an additional 100% movement speed and up to a maximum of 50% damage reduction, which when combined with just moving around causing enemies to miss their shots, makes her incredibly survivable. The exalted weapon Glory has two fire modes, the first being a fairly normal pistol with a small AoE on impact, and the alt fire mode, which we'll get into in a moment. The normal firing mode will deal heat damage and works just like any other pistol regarding mods, and each hit has a 10% chance to apply the Judgement debuff to enemies. The alt fire on the other hand is quite a bit different and is a pretty amazing damage nuke. When used, it'll detonate all enemies affected by Judgment's debuff, removing the debuff from them and dealing a massive burst of damage to all enemies in range with a 1.5 times multiplier to that AoE's range if the enemy is within the radius of Light's Judgment. And enemies can be hit by multiple AoEs at once, but each enemy will only do one AoE instance per cast, so it's best used when there's a group of enemies affected by Judgment for maximum damage. Also, a super neat trick to this is that in order to activate the alt fire, you must have at least one enemy in line of sight of Jade affected by Judgment, but it will detonate all enemies affected by Judgment even if they aren't in range or in line of sight, allowing you to spread out your Light's Judgment around as much as you'd like and still get some pretty serious AoE damage over a very wide area even if you can't see them directly. Unlike the normal firing mode, the alt fire doesn't get affected by normal damage increases in mods such as Hornet Strike, Deathbringer's damage buff, or multi-shot. So if you're wanting to build around that function, which we will do in one of our builds today, you'll need to do some different modding. Also, while Jade's airborne, she'll receive bonuses from mods that require being airborne such as Aerodynamic, Aviator, or the Boreal set, and she'll be able to cast all of her other abilities including Helmets while in Glory on High. A great trick for the normal firing mode of Glory is to cast it while the Symphony of Mercy ability strength buff is active, snapshotting that strength into Glory, increasing its damage for the whole time that it's active, and then swapping to the weapon damage buff of Symphony to increase its damage further. Just keep in mind that that weapon damage buff won't work on the alt fire mode. Alright, with all that said, let's get into my builds for her. We've got a few different builds, one focused on ground-based combat, great for either melee or ranged weapon platforming, depending on your personal preferences and helmet of choice, and two variations focusing on Glory on High, one for the regular pistol mode, and one focusing all in on the kabooms from its alt fire. Haha, I almost had you there. You didn't think that Jade could escape my crippling addiction to arcane persistence, did you? With that percentage healing per second from Light's Judgment? No, sir, you're crazy. Of course we got a health tank with her too, just for the bit if anything, but also it's really good. Either way, let's first go over things that are going to stay the same for all of the builds. First up is Focus Schools, which if you're playing around Glory, I'd recommend using Maturai for increasing your damage and operator, but Vazarin is another excellent choice if you'd like to focus more in on the supporting, and will also increase Symphony of Mercy's range with its affinity range buff. And if you're playing more around being grounded, then I personally like to use Zeneric for the extra energy regeneration, but any focus school will work well and it's mainly up to personal preferences. Archon Shards generally are going to be the same for all of the builds, and are definitely not needed at all, and it's more of a personal preference thing. I'm using 2 Amber Shards to increase our cast speed a bit more, which I find to be nice for casting out Light's Judgment rapidly, and 3 Crimson to increase our ability strength. But none of these are really required, so make sure to use the shards that suit your playstyle and comfort. However, for our melee focus build, I'd swap out the Crimsons to Violets to increase our melee critical multiplier by a significant amount. First, let's focus on our grounded versions of Jade. Here we're playing all around our preferred weapons, with either melee or range depending on your personal preferences and helmet of choice. Some great helmet options for her here are of course our classic weapon platforming abilities like Roar, Eclipse, Zada's Whisper, Nourish, Wrathful Advance like I'm using here for a melee playstyle, Bright Bonnet for additional strength and energy, or of course any of our other powerful weapon buffing helmets. No matter what option you go for, I'd recommend putting it over her 4th ability Glory on High since we aren't going to be using it all here. The whole idea is to keep your Light's Judgment down as much as you can to offer you and your allies healing, but more importantly for the Judgment passive increasing your damage dealt to enemies by 50%, which will drastically improve your damage output. Then cast the ability Strength buff from Symphony of Mercy, cast your Ophanim Eyes to get it active, and then cast your Helmet of Choice, and then cycle Symphony of Mercy off of that ability Strength buff to the weapon damage buff, and when you need to recast your Helmet or Phantom Eyes, just cycle Symphony of Mercy back to the Strength buff, recast those abilities that you need to, and swap back to the damage buff. It takes a bit of getting used to the casting dance, but once you do, you'll see your damage drastically increase with locking that strength into her other buffs and then buffing your weapon damage significantly. For the persistence version of the build, I've gone into a melee build using Kulivo's Wrathful Advance, and so we've got Steel Charge here along with Growing Power for our auras. But if you're not using melee as your main damage source, I'd swap this over to Corrosive Projection to help reduce enemies' armor a bit faster. Since we're on the ground, I've gone with Prime Sure-Footed, but if you don't like it, then I'd swap out for Power Drift for more strength and a bit of knockdown resistance. Since we're going into Arcane Persistence, I've got Health Conversion here to get our armor up to activate Persistence, so make sure that you're bringing a companion with Synth Deconstruct. I've also gone with Rolling Guard here to cleanse Jade of any status effects that could turn off Persistence, but an alternative helmet of choice is Hideous Resistance or Titania's Spellbind, which will protect you from status effects as well as other knockdowns, freeing up both the Prime Sure-Footed and Rolling Guard slots. Another excellent option for dealing with status effects is the Worm with its Negate Precept, protecting you from status effects every few seconds. This will also free up a mod slot for a helmet augment like Shock with Shock Trooper or Thermal Sunder with Thermal Transfer, or just to free up Rolling Guard's mod slot for some more duration or strength. Otherwise, we're going high into strength to increase our Symphony's damage and strength buffs, to make Ophanim Eyes remove defenses faster, and increase the healing amount from Jade's Judgement, which is how we'll maintain our health values with Persistence. Then we've got a bit of duration so that we don't have to recast our buffs as often, and Archon Stretch for a bit of range and energy regeneration, which is being activated by a companion. For Arcanes, we're obviously using Arcane Persistence because duh, but also using Arcane Blessing to increase our health to 2200 when it's fully charged, which will play well into Light's Judgment percentage healing per second, allowing Jade to be basically invincible with well over 500 health a second returned from that. If you don't want to use Persistence, here's a variation of the build which is basically doing the same thing but with shields, using Adaptation to reduce the amount of damage we take, Primary Direction to amp up our shield values, and more strength with Transient Fortitude. For Arcanes, we swapped out for Arcane Energize for a bit of energy, but Molt Augmented is another good choice if you're not running into energy problems, and Arcane Aegis to help us sustain our shields a bit more, with Brief Respite to kickstart our shields and give us a bit of shield gating as needed. I play this more with my primary weapon, so I also use 2 Augur mods on my secondary for additional shield regeneration, but a shield regeneration helmet like Harrow's Condemn or Hildren's Pillage are excellent alternative choices, and or using a companion like the Raska or Taxon to restore shields every once in a while. Don't forget to use Symphony's shield buff as needed to help regenerate your shields. Now let's get into our 2 builds focusing on Glory on High with its 2 different firing modes. Here we're spending all of our time flying around shooting at enemies with either the primary pistol mode of Glory, or causing massive AoE damage with its alt fire detonating anyone who's affected by Judgement, which technically can be done at the same time with the primary focused version, but it's much more effective with the alt fire focused version. Depending on which of the 2 versions you'd like to play around, each are going to have different mods for both Jade and Glory, which we'll get to in a second. The reason being for Glory is, like we mentioned during the ability section, that Glory's alt fire doesn't gain damage from normal damage sources like Hornet Strike, and Multi-Shot does nothing for it. So if you're wanting to maximize the AoE damage from detonating Judgments with Glory's alt fire, it needs a different build. For Helmet, I personally love to use Hildren's Pillage for shield regeneration, status cleansing, and defense removal from enemies. However, for the normal firing mode of Glory, any of the good weapon platforming helmets will do well, and for the AoE version, the alternative that I recommend using is Roar if you don't want to use Pillage, as that will increase the AoE's nuking damage unlike most other helmets. But Noko's Bright Bonnet's also a good choice here for some more strength and energy. No matter which of the build versions you're using, I'd recommend putting the helmet over her third ability, Ophanim Eyes, as while it's good, it's the least useful of her abilities for this kind of playstyle, but keep in mind that the build works well as a no helmets build if that's more your playstyle. There is a bit of a different playstyle for the AoE nuking version, which is mainly just throwing down Light's Judgment on the ground anytime that you see a group of enemies, and then activate Glory's alt fire after that, which will cause any enemy affected by Judgment to detonate, even enemies who are not in line of sight, and you don't want to swap off the ability strength buff from Symphony of Mercy because the damage buff from Deathbringer doesn't affect the AoE damage at all, so no need to rotate the ability around with this playstyle. However, if you're focusing on the primary fire mode, you'll want to use that strength buff from Symphony of Mercy before you cast Glory on High, which will allow you to snapshot that extra strength into Glory's damage, and then swap Mercy to Deathbringer to further increase its damage. Here's the mods for the alt fire build first. Since I'm using Pillage, I've gone with Growing Power and Corrosive Projection to increase our strength and reduce the amount of strength we need for Pillage to 100% armor strip thanks to Corrosive Projection, but honestly use whatever aura makes the most sense for you. Since we're going to be flying around the whole time, I'm using Aviator to reduce the damage that we take while airborne by 40%, which plays well into Shield's natural 50% damage reduction, Glory on High's 50% damage reduction, as well as the Boreal set on a polearm and Boreal's Hatred giving a further 40% damage reduction, more shields, and a tad bit of efficiency to make Glory on High and the alt fire drain less energy, making her basically a flying tank. Otherwise, we're going high into range to increase Light's Judgment AoE to more consistently apply Judgment for us to detonate, increasing that detonates AoE, and for Pillage's effective range. Here we have Equilibrium and Energize for our energy economy, and as much strength as we can manage to increase our damage as much as possible, and to get us to the 100% armor removal point for pillage. However, another great option here is Arcane Crepuscular with a companion like the Hurus or Shade, as the alt-fire doesn't break their invisibility, giving Glory a ton more critical damage, but sadly the loss of strength from Molt Augmented does bring us below the threshold for pillage to 100% armor strip with a single cast, but that can easily be fixed by swapping out Boreal's Hatred for Augur Secrets, but you might need to be a little bit more careful with your energy. The AoE build's Glory is rather simple, where we're just slapping on as much elemental damage and critical damage as we can because of that whole normal damage and multi-shot not affecting it. Since it's got not a great base critical chance, I'd recommend using secondary Enervate to fuel the AoE's crits. If you're someone who likes faction mods, just swap out either Jolt or Scorch for your faction mod of choice because it will drastically increase your damage, but I'm personally not a fan of faction mods, so I'm not using them here. For the build focusing on the primary fire mode of Glory, here's Jade's mods. Since we aren't focusing on AoE here, we don't need as much range and thus are able to focus much more on our durability, with aerodynamic and adaptation giving us much more damage reduction, making Jade just that much more tanky, with additional strength to improve our buffs and damage output. Just like before, Pillage is an excellent choice, but any of our previously mentioned ranged weapon platform helmets will do well here, and if you're going for a helmet that needs an augment or want to use Jade's Judgement, I'd swap out Boreal's Hatred for that, and of course this works perfectly well as a no helmets build if that's more your playstyle. Keep in mind that the Arcane Crepuscular tech that we mentioned before doesn't work with the primary fire mode, as the primary fire of Glory will break the invisibility granted to you by a Shade or Hurus. As for the Glory build, this time we're able to take advantage of multi-shot, fire rate, and normal damage, so that's what we've done, and like before we're using secondary Enervate to fuel our crits with Prime Target Cracker and Magnetic Might to increase its critical damage. Don't forget about the Furix Amalgam mod, which will grant your Glory more fire rate for free if you're not needing the additional damage reduction from a polearm using the Boreal set. And there we go, 4 different builds and playstyles for you to enjoy the Origin System's best mom in whatever way you'd like. She's an incredible weapon platform for either melee or ranged, and has stunning amounts of nuking capabilities with her Glory's alt fire, and can rain hell down on Earth while being an incredibly durable frame, all while also offering your whole squad some really impressive utility and support. With builds like these here, no squad will be sad to see a Jade in their team because of just how much she brings to the table. Well, they might be a bit sad with the amount of nuking that she can do, but hey, what can you do? I hope that you all enjoyed today's video, and I hope that you learned something new about Jade in preparation for our next big patch, Jade Shadows Constellations, coming in June. And maybe you got some inspiration for a build of your own. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of the video, a like is always appreciated, and as always, sub for more tips and swing by my stream if you need any help.